I am very glad to be participating in this year's Fall Focus. We had the weather break for you because we had a Missouri State Fair the last, I don't know how many days, and it was unbearably hot, and we still made it through that. I'm almost recovered from the State Fair. It's the first time since I've been at the University of Missouri that usually you moved out of the State Fair on Sunday with your camper, and I walked right back in the classroom on Monday morning and started to teach. And for whatever reason this year, we got a week of reprieve between the fair and classes starting next Monday. So very happy to have that opportunity, and that gave me time to participate in this event. The information that they're going to collect on that bowl selection, the $10 is good, but you probably need to get the right answer, because right now I'm not sure you can buy a value meal at McDonald's for the $10. And I know McDonald's just came out with an article that said we're gonna ratchet that price down by 15% because you all are mad. All right, and so that right there is an example of some things we talked about last year. All right, I had the opportunity to talk about what's the consumer want and where are things, right? We talked about inelastic demand for beef. How long will they continue to pay for expensive beef? Seems like they're still in there with us. But we have some other things that we really need to try to tackle. Now, the thing is, it was a year ago. I have slept a lot of nights since we were in Amarillo. I'm going to try to figure out what we learned last year. I'm going to try to hit some highlights here. I actually dug back in my notes, and there are some one-liners in here that if you were part of that meeting, you'll have context to understand some of this with Ty Lawrence and others. But oh, that's really small font on my part. My eyeballs can't read that on my screen. All right, so we learned a couple of things. We had some Packer conversations last year, and what was very prominent from that is Packers were caring about quality grade foremost in that moment. I think that's probably still true today because the choice select spread is still quite large. So there's incentive that we need to keep pressure on that. If our cattle will grade, we need to feed them to grade. So that was one message that we got last year. The one that we're going to probably tackle today to the greatest degree is carcasses are big and they're getting bigger. I will say that I'm not sure that's a good thing for us. I'm not sure we're tooled correctly to let that happen. And that's going to be something that we're going to unfold here, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. I brought up last year in a side conversation that as our cattle are getting bigger, our muscles are getting bigger in those cattle for a lot of them, and the ribeye is getting bigger. And at what point do we get to a threshold where the ribeye is too big? And one of the conversations from the Packers side was, we'll just let the consumer finally push back on us and say it's too big. That's putting a lot of faith in the consumer, I suppose. And one of the challenges is, and if I mentioned this last year, is we sell a ribeye on a weight basis when we sell it at retail, or we sell it in a restaurant trade. So one of the implications for a larger and larger ribeye is to sell it on a weight basis, we have to slice it thinner. We slice it thinner, we lose some insurance that it's going to cook well and eat well. So there are implications unless we decide to portion the ribeye, which is blasphemy in most circles in meats, right? Portion the ribeye. We do it with the sirloin, but we also, in our mind, view the sirloin as a lesser valued cut, right, at the end of the day. So if we get these really big ribeye areas and we're going to keep selling on a weight basis and slice them thin, there are implications for that. And I mean, I've seen some huge ribeyes in plants in the last year. Our meats judging kids are struggling with this. And there's a whole conversation in this country around yield grade and does the yield grade equation still predict, right? And we won't open that can of worms today, but there's some evidence that says the yield grade equation only predicts 40% of the variation in cutout on cattle. That's a problem. We'll take that up in another fall focus, okay? Last year when we had this conversation, one of the pushes that we got was tenderness was not a problem in beef. And then Dr. Dykman very pointedly said, Bryon, it's still a problem. It's just that it's not up as high on the list as it used to be. All right, so when we look at where we are in that top 10 things that challenge the beef industry, and we look at beef quality audit and these kinds of things, tenderness was our main problem for a long time. All right, in the 90s, it was a problem. We got in the early 2000s, it started to find its way. We should not walk away from tenderness, because if we look at competing proteins, they have a tenderness problem that they've never had before. All right, I'll pick on the chicken people. All right, some of you get that airline chicken breast and you're cooking it and that muscle fiber is weird to start, right? It's got a lot, it's long, it's kind of stringy. You've got some issues with it. We never used to talk about chicken breast being tough. We really never talked about pork loin being tough to any great degree. And in certain corners of those protein spaces, that is a problem. All right, we don't want to go back to that. We want to let them own the toughness thing, right? They can have that in their side of the equation. There are a couple things that if you were at the meeting, I pulled these out. This was a word, this came out, says, don't serve good beef to idiots that crash your party. I can't exactly remember the context for that conversation, but it sure resonated with me. And I was thinking about this when I was at the fair. So I live at the Missouri State Fair for all the nights, like a number of people in this room do as well, if you're a Missourian. And sometimes people just drop in on you at the fair, right? You're out in the campground, you got your Blackstone going, you got your Weber going, and here we are cooking, and then they show up. And my kids are a problem for me. My kids are almost all adult children now, but they drag people along from the fair, and I'll look up and I say, who is that? And do you really think they're going to eat the steak that I just cooked? They're like, Dad, they're here at the fair and they don't have a lot of money and they need to eat. And I'm like, well, there's a McDonald's down the street in Sedalia. And they're like, well, they can't afford McDonald's. Oh, full circle moment, right? They can't afford McDonald's. So here I am, and I won't say they're idiots. That's a little harsh, but that's what they said in Amarillo, right? Don't let the idiots crash the party and eat your best beef. We also learned that you should never let beef near a microwave. That was Ty Lawrence, right? And we went through this sensory panel thing in the classroom there. And his grad students were cooking product and bringing it to us, and we were doing the sensory work. And one of the last samples was the worst beef I think I've ever eaten. You know, and of course he doesn't tell you on the front end. He's like, yeah, it's terrible. We cooked that in a microwave, right? We know, in this room, we know that beef doesn't go in the microwave, right? I don't know that all of our consumers know that, but we know in this room, right? So there's some things that we were learning there. Cookery matters, all right? Our product has a certain way it should probably be prepared, and the microwave is not one of them. We learned yesterday and last year that the beef on dairy situation in this moment is probably plugging a big chunk of our supply gap, all right? And that's a reality for us. And I know that sometimes I get in circles of the purists in the beef industry, and they kind of dismiss this dairy component. Well, right now it's plugging a supply gap for us, and it's probably keeping our consumers hanging in there with this because at some point, if the supply gets too low and the price gets too high, I think some consumers will leave us. All right, I'm not an economist, I'm a meat scientist, but I do buy beef. All right, so I think we have that situation. In the current moment, you know, we didn't talk about this explicitly last year, but here's just some things that are on my mind as I left Amarillo. Cold cow prices are crazy, and it's partly because the price of trim is crazy. And if you don't believe that, we just opened a new beef plant in Missouri, and the primary focus that's going to be supply side is going to be cold cows and bulls. At some point, it'll be some A-majority cattle. All right, but right now, when we start making decisions about are we keeping cows, are we not keeping cows, and man, when you look at what a cold cow will bring, or a bull, I've had no less than 5 conversations in the last few months. I sold a bull at the sale barn, and he brought more than I paid for him as a breeding piece. There's heads nodding in the crowd. That's a weird place to be, right? And then you don't want to tell your bull supplier that, because then what happens? Yeah, they're like, oh, well, if that's the case, probably ought to raise the price, right? So there's some weird stuff happening, and it probably has some implications for us. On Wednesday, I just went into the price reporting, and I grabbed some information out of USDA. And where you, John, read cattle facts, I do the USDA reporting every day. And there's a one-page document that comes out, and it tells us how heavy are our cattle, what's the choice select spread, how many loads did we trade, what was the quality call on those loads, all these kinds of things. And I'm a visual learner, so the graphics are kind of interesting here. So this is, looking over my glasses because I can't see, these are the trends on our dressed weights. All right, so that black line at the bottom is 23, the blue line is 24, the red line is 25. All right, you go back to the beginning of the year, we were at record weights, record dressed weights. That's steers and heifers combined, that's USDA data. It doesn't capture all the cattle, but man, we were at 930 some pounds. There's a window in there. We put 36 pounds of carcass weight on cattle in less than a year. 36 pounds of carcass weight. So there's no doubt that at least the market's saying, we'll just keep bringing bigger cattle. And we've relaxed the top end of this, right? So the heavy discounts aren't as painful. And it's hard to find a 7-weight carcass in a plant anywhere. 8s and 9s are normal. And we've got the normal, what happens with us as we get into summer. We have some issues there where cattle can't find their way just for some different environmental reasons. But when we're in good weather and we can press them, we'll feed these cattle super heavy. That's going to swing back up, and as we get into fall, I don't think there's any reason to believe that cattle are going to get any lighter, right? Corn's cheap. Talk about that just here real quick. Here's the choice cutout, the value of choice cutout. All right, it says packers prefer cattle that have quality, and they're paying. All right, they're paying, and they're complaining because they're paying right now. So if you're in the packing industry right now, you're like, oh, my margins are tight. If you're in the feeding industry, you're like, ha ha. Right? I mean, that's how we behave in this industry, for being realistic. It's kind of an us and them kind of thing. I'm an academic. I just live in the middle and watch it. But right now, it says values needs to be there. And if you don't believe that, look at the choice select spread. It's $20-some. We had it pressing up in the $30-some range earlier in the year. So, I mean, the reality says that they still expect us to bring quality cattle. There's the choice select spread. It was really big at the beginning of the year. Pulled that back a little bit, but it's ramping its way back up. So what this says is they're expecting quality. If your cattle can get it over the hump of the select plus to the choice minus window, all right, this says you should feed them. But there are some implications for doing that too, right? It's a cost gain, value gain conversation. We have to look at all facets of this conversation. The packer only gets those cattle in the one moment in time at the end of their life, right? And we can walk through a cooler and we can say, well, these cattle are worth X in this moment, but we often don't think about what was the entire backstory that got that calf to that point in time. And what we really don't think about is what was the female that made that calf that is so heavy that we're expecting today. And what came out clearly last year from the audience, when Ty and others got off the stage, there was the question, right? What are we as people that are making cows supposed to do with this? Because we know there are implications. If as I was growing up, the conversation was, if you want big bulls, you got big cows to make big bulls. The big bulls will make big steers. Okay. Is there a way to maybe not have to go there? All right? An analogy I'll give you is I sell hay by the ton. All right? I don't sell hay by the bale here in Missouri. I sell it by the ton. Why do I sell it by the ton? Well, I use a New Holland baler. I crank the hydraulic pressure on that chamber down as tight as I can crank it down because I don't want to handle a lot of bales. I want to handle fewer bales at the same weight going out the door, right? That is something that Missouri hay buyers are they're like, what? How much is it a bale? Oh, good. I'll do the math, right? I can give you a 1,350-pound bale of good grass hay, and we'll back into it. I'll tell you how much it is a bale. But if you're coming to my farm to haul it, Wouldn't you rather make fewer trips and take the same amount of hay away? Right, that's the packer conversation on heavy cattle. There are reasons that they'll say, yeah, I want them bigger, as long as they don't have so much bark on the outside that I have to carve it off. So we're relaxing yield grade 4 discounts. We kind of look the other way. We've been doing that for a little while. Yield grade 5s, we're still hard on you. All right, so there's a sweet spot in there. And they say, make them bigger, because I have to knock fewer cattle. Think about that from a humane standpoint. The fewer number of bolts I have to put on the head of cattle to knock them, the fewer chances I have to be not in compliance on a humane knock. There's weird things you just don't think about sitting out there. This is the weird stuff I think about as a meat scientist, because I have to answer to the USDA when we don't do a good job of knocking those cattle. But we know the implications are great, right? We take these cattle to bigger and bigger weights. We got heart failures. That big heat wave that came through Sedalia, well, it hit Kansas too, right? I've got a former student, she called. I said, are you coming to the fair this year? Nope. I'm dragging dead cattle out of feedlot, right? They had cattle that were 3-4 days up from going, and they were falling over dead, right? That exacerbates our problem. And the packer, right, I don't blame them. The packer's like, well, that's not my problem. They're my issue once you get them to me. But man, today when you lose a feeder calf or a newborn calf or one that's right at the end of the game, that's painful economics, right? One of the things that we've seen in terms of trends with this in the competition, all right, that top line is the retail price for beef. Our retail price has gone up faster than the retail price of the competition, being poultry and pork. And it appears that we're kind of settled in. But, you know, where is there a ceiling? I don't know if there's a ceiling or not. But we have separated ourselves out in the industry, and we talk a little bit about that being inelastic demand. Our consumer will go with us no matter what. There's lots of reasons for that. We talked about that a fair bit in Amarillo. The things that really challenge us, and this is where I have conversations with my students. You know, the carcass hanging in the cooler is worth X today. But we really need to talk about all the things that influence that conversation. And today, the cow and bull inventory is light. The calf inventory is quite low. The market weight's quite high. Consumption or demand is pretty high, regardless of some of these external factors. Although I think if you talk to your local banker, they will tell you that consumer debt is going through the ceiling and deposits are going way down. All right, so there's probably a minute here where consumers are going to have to make a decision. They're going to figure out they don't have money. Right? And we've had some wacky stuff going on in the world, right? We're building that new meats facility on campus. We have a contract for a 2-truck pass-through oven to go in that meats facility. The supplier came back and said, you do know that's manufactured in Germany, and they haven't started building your oven. Well, you know what the implications for that are. We're super tight on our budget anyway, and now they want to have a conversation about what the tariff that's going to be on that product to come in here to put that oven in our facility. And it's a big number, right? It's a big number. So we've got some of these external things that press us in the business. And then the other things that come and go, right? We've already talked about weather. We just had this heat wave come through. Somebody lost a lot of money on some cattle. Corn price, well, this fall it looks like everybody's going to raise a corn crop. Everybody, right? You drive around here in north central Missouri, there's pieces of dirt that haven't grown that kind of corn ever. But it rained every third day. And we got fungicide on. And we got the nitrogen side dress on. And the corn's going to be good. Therefore, the corn will be worth very little, right? It goes back to the whole price per bale or price per ton conversation. It takes a lot to get 300 bushel corn from field to bin. But we can put it in cattle. It's cheap. The feeder margin is good. Should continue for some time. We have this conversation at our farm out here at the university. I'm like, we're feeding cattle, folks. We're feeding cull cows. We're feeding everything we got. We're putting white fat on our cull cows. We're going to sell them. They're worth a lot of money. Land price puts pressure on the whole situation. That up there in the upper right, that's American Farm Bureau puts that out. If it's red, those are significant increases in land price. Well, we as ranchers, farmers and ranchers in the cattle business, we're competing with that, right? Because that's row crop is driving that. And it won't come down as quick as it went back up. But now we've got our row crop friends, and if you're in the row crop business, you know this is a problem too. But now we got soybeans less than $10, and we got corn hovering in a 3-something mark, and we still have land values up here. And that puts pressure on us if we're in grazing operations, ranching operations. We're competing with another piece of our own ag business. Operating interest is going up. People have to borrow money to do the business. That gives us some pause as well. So all that said, what are the implications for heavier fed cattle? Because that's really where we have to kick this thing off, right? The implications could be larger cows. Could be larger cows. Does it have to be larger cows? I hope somebody can help us unfold that today. All right, we put pressure on other things and we get the curve to bend. All right, birth weight and calving ease. All right, they aren't the same trait. We can have calves that weigh in the middle of that continuum, and the cow has that calf no problem. We continue to put pressure on birth weight, and it's lower and lower and lower. There's an implication for that as well, right? Increased days on feed, pushing these cattle to more longer and longer days in the lot. All right, that's more days for them to have a respiratory illness problem. That's more days for them to encounter the heart failure situation. It's more days for them to live through seasons where we have mud and then we have heat and then we have whatever. All right, so the more days those cattle are alive, the more opportunity they have to die before we need them to die. One thing that I thought about in terms of export, if we keep cattle longer and it's just getting them to a weight, right? And if they're older cattle, we start to bump up against some things that give us pause in terms of export. 30-month cattle, hard-bone cattle, physiologically mature cattle. All right, so those are some things we should think about. The health risk piece I've already talked about, putting more bark on the back of those cattle. You're going to hear some conversation. We talk about this a lot in our shop. Dr. Corder and I were talking about this the other day. We have this conversation about, but they're still gaining 3 pounds a day, even way out there at the end. But is that weight gain, is it all equivalent? Back here when we were gaining 5 pounds a day, what were we putting on that animal versus we're still gaining? So it looks like cost of gain and value of gain are fine, but is all weight gain equivalent, right? Are we putting more fat on those cattle? We're putting more in their middle section. Is there the value in what's going to get cut out, right? Does that go in the offal barrel? I don't know all the answers to that, but those are things we need to think about in terms of the details. So I think where we're going to end up today, hopefully we'll get a lot of important nuggets from a lot of people that really understand this aspect. And we're going to get it from the cow side, right? The in utero side, and then we're going to go all the way to the end. So very glad that we're here. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of thought from where we've been, where we were last year, and I'm excited to see where we end up. Thank you.